The charity gala was supposed to be a peaceful evening, the kind where guests wandered from table to table with gentle smiles. Soft music played in the background, and quiet conversations echoed through the beautifully decorated hall. Lights hung from the ceiling like floating stars, shimmering across the polished floor. Servers moved gracefully between guests, carrying trays of sparkling drinks. Everything seemed delicate, calm, and perfectly arranged for a memorable night. But the calmness broke the moment the young pianist walked toward the stage. He wasn't dressed like the other performers. While many wore designer suits and glittering gowns, he wore a simple, clean shirt and an old jacket that had clearly been worn many times. His shoes were polished but not new. His appearance wasn't sloppy, just modest. And in a room filled with people who believed wealth defined value, modesty stood out more sharply than anything else. A few guests exchanged puzzled looks. Some whispered. Others simply glanced at him, then at the event schedule, as if trying to understand how someone like him ended up performing at an elite charity event. Near the center table, where the most influential donors were seated, a tycoon sat with a glass of expensive wine in his hand. He was known for his successful business empire, his sharp instincts, and his even sharper tongue. People tried not to upset him because his opinions could make or break someone's reputation in an instant. And when he saw the young pianist step toward the grand piano, he didn't hold back. "Who allowed this?" he said loudly, not caring that others could hear. "This is a charity gala, not a street show. Why bring in someone who looks like he borrowed that jacket from a second-hand shop?" A few people laughed softly, the kind of laugh someone makes when they're not sure if they should join in, but don't want to upset the powerful man at the table. The pianist heard the comment everyone did. His shoulders stiffened for a moment, but he kept walking. He didn't look angry or offended. He looked embarrassed, like he wished he could disappear into the polished floor. One of the event volunteers hurried over to the tycoon and tried to explain. The young pianist, named Elias, had been recommended by the charity director. He came from a humble background, yes, but he was talented, really talented. The kind of talent they wanted to highlight that night to inspire donors to support young artists who lacked opportunities. But the tycoon waved his hand dismissively. "Talent? We'll see about that," he said. "Music doesn't come from luck. It takes training. Real training. Does he even know what a real piano feels like?" The pianist paused just before sitting at the bench. He wasn't close enough to confront the man, and he wasn't the sort to start a scene anyway. But he heard every word, and so did everyone around him. The room felt heavier suddenly, as if the warmth and excitement of the gala had been pushed aside to make space for doubt. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. His hands, though strong from years of practice, trembled slightly, not out of fear, but because he felt the weight of judgment pressing against him. When you come from a place where people constantly question your worth, it becomes a familiar pressure but never an easy one. The event host approached him quietly, leaning close so no one else would hear. "You don't have to play anything too difficult," she whispered. "Just something simple. The audience will be fine with it." She meant well, but her tone carried the same doubt as the others. She wasn't trying to discourage him, she just didn't want him to embarrass himself in front of important people. But those soft, protective words hit him harder than the tycoon's loud insult. Simple, as if that was all he was capable of. He sat down at the piano bench and lifted his hands to the keys. The surface of the grand piano felt smooth beneath his fingers, 1,000 times smoother than the old, half-broken keyboard he practiced on at home. That keyboard had missing keys, loose wires, and a volume button that would sometimes get stuck. But it was his, and it was what his father had saved up for years to buy. His father, his biggest supporter, his closest friend, the person who told him that music didn't come from perfect instruments but from a heart that felt deeply enough to play honestly. He remembered the small smile on his father's face the day he brought home the second-hand keyboard. "It's not new," his father had said, "but it's something, and from something, you can build anything." Elias rubbed his hands together to warm his fingers. The room around him buzzed with low murmured conversations. The tycoon's comments had spread through the hall. Some guests were already assuming the performance would be forgettable or worse, unpleasant. He couldn't blame them. People judged quickly, especially when someone didn't look like they belonged. But he wasn't here to prove his clothing wrong. He wasn't here to argue. He wasn't here to impress the wealthy. He was here because his father always believed that one day, someone important would hear him. Someone who could help open doors that had always been locked to him. This night, even if it started with judgment, was still a door, The piano lid was open, reflecting the warm lights above. He leaned forward slightly and closed his eyes for a moment, not to block out the faces, but to find the memory that always helped him center himself, the memory of his father sitting beside him during late-night practice, quietly nodding along with the music. A soft breath escaped his lips behind him. The Tycoon laughed again, saying to someone at his table, "Let's hope he doesn't break the keys." The joke wasn't funny, but a few people laughed politely anyway. Elias opened his eyes. For 1 second, he let himself acknowledge the sting of those words. It hurt. Anyone would feel hurt. But just as quickly, he let the feeling pass, because he remembered something his father once told him. You don't play to silence doubters. You play to awaken hearts. His foot pressed lightly on the pedal. His fingers hovered above the keys, ready. But before he began, he glanced at the audience, not with anger, not with fear, but with a calm resolve. He didn't need them to believe in him right away. He just needed to start. The event hall, sensing the beginning of the performance, grew quieter. Not silent, just slightly more attentive. Glasses still clinked, a few people still whispered, but their eyes were now pointed toward him. The Tycoon leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, wearing a confident smirk. He expected failure. He expected to be proven right. But the pianist took another breath, deep and steady, and let his mind clear. He thought about the nights when he practiced in the dark because electricity was too expensive, the times when neighbors complained about the noise, the moments when he doubted himself and almost quit. He thought about his father holding his hand through the hardest years, reminding him that talent has nothing to do with background, and slowly, his hands lowered onto the keys. Before a single note was played, the audience could sense something shifting, not loudly, not dramatically, just a subtle air of focus, like the room itself understood this moment mattered to him, even if it didn't yet matter to them. Elias didn't start with a flashy opening. He didn't rush. Instead, he let his fingers rest gently, preparing for a beginning that felt more like a quiet conversation than a performance. He knew some people doubted him. He knew some people believed he shouldn't have been invited. But he also knew something deeper, something the Tycoon didn't understand. He wasn't there by accident. He wasn't there because someone pitied him. He was there because behind the modest clothes and shy posture was someone who had fought for every moment at a piano. And as he finally pressed the first key, he promised himself he would give the room something they couldn't ignore, not arrogance, not force, but truth. The first gentle note echoed softly across the hall, and in that single sound was years of struggle, hope, heartbreak, and determination, years that no insult could erase. The first note Elias played floated gently through the room, soft enough that people had to quiet down to hear it properly. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was simple, almost delicate, yet it carried a kind of honesty that made a few guests look up from their wine glasses. Some might have expected him to rush into something bold to prove himself immediately, especially after the insults thrown his way. But Elias didn't believe in rushing. He let the notes breathe, letting each one settle in the air before moving to the next. It was how his father taught him. Music isn't a race, it's a story. As he continued, his shoulders slowly relaxed, the trembling in his fingers calmed, his breathing evened out. The world outside the piano seemed to fade a little, the conversations, the whispers, the clinking glasses, all of it softened around him. All that remained was the music, the faint light reflecting off the polished surface of the piano, and the memory that guided his hands. A few more notes spilled out, forming a gentle melody, and for the first time since he stepped onto the stage, Elias felt grounded. He was no longer the young man being judged by strangers. He wasn't the underdressed performer surrounded by wealthy guests. He wasn't the target of the Tycoon's mocking comments. He was simply someone who loved the piano. In the audience, the change didn't go unnoticed. A middle-aged woman who had been whispering to her friend suddenly leaned forward, her expression softening. A group of 3 younger guests, who had been scrolling through their phones, placed them face down on the table. Even the staff passing by slowed their steps as the music floated across the hall. But not everyone softened so quickly. The Tycoon still sat with a doubtful smirk on his face, swirling the wine in his glass lightly. His expression was unreadable, a mix of boredom and expectation. He believed the soft start was a sign of lack of confidence, a way to hide in gentleness instead of showing real skill. He's playing like he's afraid to touch the keys, the Tycoon muttered to the person beside him. Let's see if he can do more than that. His voice wasn't as loud as before, but loud enough for nearby tables to hear. A few eyes darted toward him, unsure whether to agree or stay silent. Some people were beginning to enjoy the music, but didn't want to upset the wealthiest man in the room. Elias didn't hear the comment clearly, but he didn't need to. He knew the kind of doubt people carried when they saw someone like him performing in such a grand place. He had heard similar doubts throughout his life, from neighbors, from schoolmates, even from strangers who saw him practicing in public spaces. He continued to play anyway, letting the melody unfold naturally. As the piece progressed, something began to shift, not suddenly, but steadily, like a slow sunrise spreading color across the sky. The melody grew a little richer, the rhythm deeper. It was as if Elias's hands were slowly remembering the strength they carried, the courage that had carried him through countless struggles. And with each note, the room leaned in a little more. His thoughts drifted back to his childhood, not in a way that distracted him, but in a way that fueled him. He remembered the small apartment where he grew up, the uneven wooden floor, the faded curtains that barely kept out the cold during winter. He remembered his father working long hours and still finding time to sit beside him at night. There were days when the keyboard keys stuck, when the sound was off, when he felt frustrated enough to cry. But every time he wanted to walk away, his father always said the same words: "Play with your heart, not your surroundings." Now, sitting at a grand piano far more expensive than anything he had ever touched before, those words mattered more than ever. People were still murmuring around the hall, but their voices softened as the music deepened. The melody began to build, not too fast, not too flashy, but with a quiet confidence that felt genuine. It wasn't about showing off, it was about telling a story only he could tell. He thought about the moment he was invited to the gala. The charity director had been impressed by him after hearing him play at a small community event. She told him he had something rare, not just talent, but sincerity. She believed people needed to hear him, especially at events where hearts were often buried under luxury and surface-level politeness. But Elias knew the invitation came with risks. People in such settings didn't always welcome someone like him, someone who came from a humble place, someone who didn't fit the image of a polished classical performer. He expected judgment, but he came anyway because opportunities like this didn't appear often. On the other side of the hall, a young violinist waiting for her turn to perform listened attentively. She had performed at many events and was used to hearing all kinds of pianists, but something about Elias's tone stopped her. It wasn't perfect, there were tiny hesitations, tiny shakes, but it was real. And in a world full of polished performances, realness was rare. Meanwhile, the Tycoon leaned back, still waiting for something spectacular, something dramatic. He didn't appreciate gentle emotion unless it was wrapped in skill, so sharp it was impossible to ignore. To him, talent meant confidence, power, and showmanship. Softness, in his mind, was a sign of weakness. "Is this it?" he whispered, annoyance creeping into his voice. "Is he going to play like this the whole time?" But what the Tycoon didn't realize was that Elias wasn't finished, not even close. As the melody reached a turning point, Elias shifted his posture slightly. His fingers moved with a little more weight, a little more intention. His eyes opened slowly as if he were returning from a memory and stepping fully into the present moment. Then the tone changed, not drastically, but clearly. The notes grew fuller, his touch firmer. He wasn't just playing softly anymore. He was building something that came from years of resilience, something he had kept tucked inside for far too long. The guests felt the change immediately. Conversations faded. Forks and knives stopped clinking. Even the Tycoon, who had been casually sipping wine, paused mid-movement. Elias's confidence bloomed in the music. It wasn't loud confidence, it was quiet but powerful, the kind that pulled people in without asking for attention. His hands moved across the piano with a grace that came from countless hours of practice. In a small living room, from nights when he played until his fingers ached, from moments when music was the only thing that helped him breathe, the melody swelled into something more expressive. It wasn't dramatic or showy, but it carried weight, it carried longing, it carried truth. Someone in the audience whispered, "He's actually really good." "Good," another replied softly. "He's amazing." Even a few people at the Tycoon's table exchanged surprised looks. The Tycoon, however, refused to acknowledge any shift. He sat straighter, narrowing his eyes at the stage. It wasn't that he couldn't hear the improvement, it was that he didn't want to admit he might have judged too quickly. Pride had built the foundation of his life, and pride rarely allowed space for correction. Elias's mind drifted again, this time to the day he almost quit music. His father had fallen sick suddenly, and life became a struggle of hospital visits, bills, and uncertainty. He couldn't focus on the piano during that period, not when everything felt like it was falling apart. But one night, sitting beside his father's bed, he played a soft melody just to comfort him. His father had listened with closed eyes and a faint breath, but he smiled. "Don't stop," he whispered, "not because of me. Music kept you alive. Let it keep you going." That night stayed with Elias, and now, as he played before a hall of strangers, he felt the weight of those words resting gently on his shoulders. The music flowed with more emotion, and the room grew quieter still. People leaned forward, drawn in by the depth slowly taking shape. Some even forgot about their plates, their conversations, their schedules. The young pianist they had doubted moments earlier was pulling them into a world they didn't expect to enter tonight. A few tables away, a couple looked at each other in surprise. "How did he end up here?" One whispered, "If he plays like this, he should be in concerts, not just charity events." Elias didn't hear their words, but he felt the shift in the room. The energy was changing. People were seeing him, not the jacket he wore, not the background he came from, but the musician behind it all. He eased into the middle part of his piece with a softness that tugged at the heart. His fingers danced lightly, each note rising and falling like a quiet confession. And in that moment, the hall no longer felt intimidating. It no longer felt judgmental. It felt like a space where he belonged, even if just for a few minutes. The Tycoon exhaled slowly, and though he tried to mask it, a flicker of curiosity appeared in his eyes. He wasn't ready to admit anything yet, but he couldn't deny that something was happening, something he hadn't expected, something he wasn't ready for. Elias continued, unaware of the Tycoon's internal struggle. All he knew was that his heart was in every note. He wasn't playing to impress. He wasn't playing to defend himself. He was playing because this was the only way he knew how to speak. And little by little, the room began to listen. The room was so still that Elias could feel the quiet pressing gently against his back. It wasn't uncomfortable, just unusual. When he first sat at the piano, the crowd barely paid attention. People chatted, laughed, and looked at him as if he didn't belong there. But now, most of that noise had faded away, replaced by a kind of focused stillness he wasn't used to receiving from large audiences. His fingers moved with a little more certainty, shaping each note with care. The song was one he often practiced alone at night, when the world outside his window was silent. It was a piece he used to play for his father when he wanted to forget the problems life threw at them. It wasn't a well-known classical song. It was something he built slowly over the years, mixing bits of old melodies with his own emotions, letting it grow with him as he matured. Tonight, it carried memories he didn't speak about to anyone. As he played, he felt the music guiding him instead of the other way around. His shoulders lifted and lowered naturally with the rhythm. His breathing matched the rise and fall of the melody. At certain moments, he forgot the hall was filled with wealthy donors, critics, and strangers who once doubted him. He forgot about the Tycoon's sharp words ringing in the air like unwanted bells. He forgot about his plain clothes and quiet entrance. For a few minutes, there was nothing but sound, pure, genuine sound. A man sitting near the front closed his eyes, letting the melody wash over him. A woman a few tables away held her hands together under her chin, surprised by the amount of emotion coming from someone so young. The violinist who had been waiting backstage stepped to the side so she could listen, without missing a single note. She wasn't jealous. She was amazed. Even the servers carrying trays slowed their pace. Some stood along the walls, holding breathless expressions as if they were afraid to disturb a fragile moment. Elias didn't see all of this, but he felt it, the subtle shift, the weight of attention. It didn't make him nervous. Instead, it gave him strength. It reminded him that music had the power to reach people in ways words couldn't. Halfway through the piece, he transitioned into a softer progression. The audience leaned in, sensing something new beginning. His fingers brushed the keys gently, almost like a whisper. This was the part of the piece he always struggled with, not because it was difficult, but because it pulled at emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel in front of others. He remembered the night the electricity in their old apartment went out during a storm. The rain outside was heavy, and the wind whistled through cracks in the walls. His father lit a candle and set it on the table beside the keyboard. "Play," he said. "Music sounds different in the dark." Elias had laughed nervously back then, thinking it was impossible to play properly with only a dim flickering light. But that night became one of the most memorable. The sound felt deeper. The darkness quieted his mind. He played gently, almost exactly like this, letting the shadowed room embrace the notes. Now, as he played in the brightly lit hall, He could almost feel that same warm candlelight around him. The Tycoon, however, didn't see memories. He saw a performance he wasn't prepared to understand. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table, eyes narrowed in concentration. The mocking smirk he wore earlier had faded. In its place was something harder to define, confusion mixed with reluctant curiosity. "This isn't what I expected," he muttered under his breath. He didn't say it loudly, but the few people seated closest to him heard. They exchanged glances, unsure if this was a sign that he was changing his mind or simply confused by the young pianist's skill. The Tycoon had attended more performances than most people in the room. He had heard trained musicians with impressive reputations. He had watched prodigies perform complex pieces flawlessly. But what he heard now wasn't flawless. It wasn't polished in the way elite performers usually sound, but it carried a rawness and honesty that felt strangely unfamiliar in such a perfect, luxurious environment. The melody deepened again, slowly climbing into a gentle wave of emotion. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it carried something that tugged at hearts without asking for permission. Elias's fingers pressed down with careful strength, guiding the music into a fuller shape. He didn't know how many people were watching him closely now. He didn't know that one of the event organizers had stopped writing her notes and stood completely still. He didn't know that someone near the back had stopped eating mid-bite, frozen as if the music had reached inside their chest. He only knew what the piano beneath his hands told him. He thought about how he used to practice on his old keyboard, sometimes in the cold, sometimes after long days when he was tired from work. He thought about the frustration he felt when keys got stuck or when the volume faded in and out. But every time, his father reminded him, "You're not practicing for the world. You're practicing for the moment the world hears you." This, he realized, was that moment. The pressure didn't scare him. It lifted him, pushed him forward. A small smile touched his lips, not one of pride, but of gratitude. Gratitude for the years that shaped him, for the pain that sharpened him, for the memories that whispered strength when life felt heavy. He continued into a subtle change in rhythm. It was softer, slower, like breathing after tears. Some in the audience didn't understand music well enough to catch the technical shift, but they felt something change. They felt their own emotions adjusting to match the softness in the sound. A woman at one table felt her eyes warm unexpectedly. She didn't know the young pianist's story, but something in the music reminded her of moments she had lost and moments she had survived. A man standing near the back cleared his throat quietly, trying to keep his composure. Music has a way of entering places words can't reach, and Elias's playing did exactly that. Across the hall, the Tycoon felt something strange, a quiet heaviness in his chest. He tried to ignore it. He tried to remind himself that the young man on stage wasn't impressive, that talent wasn't built from poverty or struggle. But the music kept pushing past those thoughts, nudging at the part of him he rarely allowed to feel anything. He stared at Elias's hands, moving with gentle precision. For the first time, he wondered what kind of life shaped that kind of touch. The melody rose slightly, still soft, but with meaning. Elias's breathing deepened as he poured more emotion into the keys. His fingers glided with a natural flow, one that came from years of playing in silence, in darkness, in moments when music was the only comfort he had. He remembered the night his father told him that life didn't always offer big chances. Sometimes opportunities came disguised as small ones: an open seat at a local event, a free instrument lesson, a borrowed keyboard. But each one mattered if you treated it like something sacred. This gala was one of those chances. He knew the Tycoon doubted him. He knew many in the room had judged him before he played even one note. He didn't hold anger in his heart for them. Instead, he played in a way he hoped would soften something in them, even if just slightly. The song moved into its emotional heart, a sequence that felt like a confession. The notes lingered longer, carrying delicate sadness and quiet hope. This was the part that always reminded him of loss, of things he couldn't bring back, of the father who sat through countless practices, guiding him gently, shaping him into the musician he was now. His hands trembled, not from nerves but from memory. Still, he kept playing. He didn't hide the tremble. He let it become part of the music, because his father had taught him that mistakes weren't always flaws, they were human, and humanity was what made music live. A few people in the crowd blinked away sudden tears. The young violinist backstage clutched the curtain lightly, unable to look away. Someone near the front whispered softly, "Where did he learn to play like that?" Elias didn't hear it. He didn't need to. He felt the connection spreading across the room, building like a gentle wave. The Tycoon shifted uncomfortably, Something in the melody reminded him of his own childhood, long before he had wealth, long before life hardened him. He hadn't expected that. He wasn't prepared for it. He swallowed, glancing away from the stage for a moment, as if trying to escape the feeling. But the music followed him. Because real emotion doesn't stay behind on stage, it travels to the listener, whether they want it or not. Elias continued, unaware of the quiet transformation happening in the audience. His focus stayed steady, his expression soft but determined. He played not for applause, not for approval, but because music was his way of speaking to the world. Softly, slowly, the melody climbed toward a point where the entire room would feel the shift he was building toward, a moment that would soon leave everyone breathless. And for the first time since the gala began, the room held its breath together. The shift in the music was so gentle at first that only a few people noticed it. The melody rose slightly, not in volume, but in emotion. It felt like someone taking a slow breath after holding it in for too long. Elias's fingers pressed a little deeper into the keys, and the notes responded with warmth that filled every corner of the hall. People no longer whispered. They no longer fidgeted or tried to look busy. Their attention rested on the stage as if the young pianist had tied an invisible thread from himself to each person in the audience. Elias didn't look up. His eyes stayed closed, as if the world around him no longer existed. His hands moved with a confidence that surprised even him. It wasn't showy confidence. It wasn't the kind you see in musicians who want to impress the crowd. It was the silent, steady confidence of someone who had lived through years of struggle and poured every lesson into his music. He leaned into the next part of the piece, a section he rarely played in public because it carried too much emotion. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the room had opened itself to him in a way he never expected. He felt safe enough to let the music take him deeper. The notes shifted into something tender, so delicate that people held their breath, just to hear it clearly. A woman near the middle of the room pressed a hand over her mouth. She didn't understand why the music affected her so strongly, but she felt something inside her soften, almost like a wound healing quietly. Across the hall, a man who had been unimpressed earlier found himself blinking slowly, confused by the warmth rising in his chest. He wasn't used to feeling emotional at events like this, but something about the melody reminded him of moments he had forgotten, evenings spent with family, long before life grew busy, long before he started carrying unspoken worries. The violinist backstage listened with her hands clasped tightly. She had heard countless pianists in her life, some technically brilliant, some charming, some impressive in their own way, but she had never heard anyone play with this level of honesty. She recognized the imperfect pauses, the small trembles, the moments where the music felt almost too personal, but those were the parts that reached her the most. Elias shifted to the heavier progression, the part that carried the weight of his past. His fingers moved with purpose, every note hitting with meaning. The melody deepened, grew fuller, and filled the hall with a sense of longing that felt almost like a story being told without words. And in a way, it was. He thought of all the nights he had played alone after his father passed away, nights where he sat at the keyboard with his head bowed, unsure if he had the strength to continue dreaming, nights where the world felt empty, and music was the only light he could cling to. Those memories shaped the chords he pressed, now soft but strong, heavy but hopeful. As the melody expanded, some guests leaned back slowly, their eyes wide. A few even placed their hands on the table as if steadying themselves. The room had shifted from admiration to astonishment. People were no longer simply watching a performance. They were witnessing something being released, something powerful and deeply human. The Tycoon felt it too, though he tried not to show it. His arms were crossed, but his fingers drummed lightly against his sleeve, betraying a nervous energy he couldn't control. He stared at Elias with a mixture of disbelief and discomfort. He had expected weakness from the young pianist. He had expected nerves, mistakes, or a plain performance that would prove his earlier judgment correct. Instead, he was met with something that cut straight through the protective shell he had spent years building around himself. The melody climbed again, rising like a wave. The audience shifted as the sound wrapped around them. It wasn't loud, but it carried the force of a quiet storm, the kind you feel in your bones before you even hear the rain. Elias opened his eyes slightly, not fully, but just enough to see the piano keys clearly. Something inside him stirred, and he let himself fall into the music completely. His hands moved faster now, but still with care. The melody transitioned into a form of controlled intensity, gentle power, soft strength. People who had earlier judged him based on his clothes, his background, or his quiet entrance now felt humbled without anyone saying a single word. The music spoke for him in a way no introduction could have. A man near the back whispered to the woman beside him, "This is unbelievable." She nodded slowly, unable to look away from the stage. "I've never heard anything like this." Even children in the hall, who typically struggled to stay still during long performances, sat frozen, their eyes wide with awe. Elias continued, letting the music swell. The hall amplified every sound perfectly, turning each note into something beautiful. Even the pauses between notes felt meaningful, like the piano itself was breathing with him. Then came the moment he always hesitated to play the part of the piece. That felt like breaking open a locked door. He hesitated for a split second, just like he always did. But then he pressed the keys and let the emotion pour out. The melody shifted into something raw. It wasn't sad exactly. It was fuller, deeper, heavier with truth. It held everything he had lived through. The nights without electricity, the days when meals were uncertain, the moments where he doubted his own worth, the memories of his father cheering him on despite their struggles. The room reacted instantly. A gasp escaped from someone near the front. A woman clasped her hands tightly together, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. A young man looked down at the table, overwhelmed by the emotions hitting him all at once. Even the Tycoon's breath caught. For the first time that night, the Tycoon looked unsure of himself. He leaned back slowly, eyes fixed on the stage, but his face revealed something almost vulnerable. He was shaken and he knew it. He had judged the young pianist before the performance even began. He dismissed him, mocked him, and expected nothing extraordinary from him. But now, watching Elias pour his entire heart into each note, he felt a discomfort he didn't know how to name. He wasn't used to being wrong. And he certainly wasn't used to feeling moved by someone he had belittled. Elias didn't know how deeply he was affecting the crowd, but he sensed something was happening. It wasn't the same kind of attention he felt earlier. This was softer, warmer, like the room had opened its arms to him. He played the next section with careful intensity. His hands moved quickly, chasing a rhythm that felt like running toward hope, toward healing. The melody carried the sound of someone trying to rise above life's pain and find meaning again. A few guests wiped their faces quietly, embarrassed yet unable to hide their emotions. Others leaned forward, elbows on the table, completely absorbed. The air in the hall thickened, not in an uncomfortable way, but in a way that made people feel as though time had slowed. When Elias reached the highest point of the piece, he paused for a split second, letting the silence sit like a glowing moment. Then he pressed down on the keys with a gentle force that sent the melody lifting through the hall. Like a silent prayer, people felt it in their chests. Some felt it in memories they hadn't touched in years. Others felt it in regrets they never spoke about. The music brushed against each person individually, yet united them in the same breath. The Tycoon swallowed hard, his throat tight. He tried to look away but couldn't. Something about the melody reminded him of his own mother, a memory he rarely allowed himself to feel. She had loved music. She used to hum quietly in the kitchen while cooking, the same tender way the piano now hummed through the hall. That memory struck him like a wave. His eyes softened without his permission. Elias's playing slowed slightly, entering the final part of the emotional arc. It felt like a gentle descent from a mountaintop, not a fall, but a peaceful glide downward. The notes were tender, soft, and full of acceptance. People listened more deeply now than they had all evening. Even the staff along the walls forgot their work for a few seconds. The hall felt sacred, like everyone inside was witnessing something too honest and too beautiful to interrupt. As the melody softened into its final shape, Elias felt a lump in his own throat. He pushed through it, letting the emotion strengthen the music instead of stopping it. His father's invisible presence felt close, almost as if he were sitting beside him again. He played the closing notes with all the care in his heart, letting them linger in the air before fading gently into silence. And when the last note faded, the entire room gasped. It wasn't loud. It wasn't messy. It was a soft, shared breath, the sound of people who had been pulled into someone else's soul and didn't know how to step out again. The silence that followed was deep and trembling. People stared at the stage, stunned. Elias gently lifted his hands from the keys, uncertain whether people would clap, speak, or remain silent. He had never felt a room freeze this completely before, but he didn't know yet that what was coming next would change everything. The applause was still echoing in the hall when the young pianist slowly lowered his hands from the keys. For a few long moments, he didn't move at all. It felt as if the world around him had frozen. He could see people standing, some clapping with both hands raised high, some wiping their eyes openly without shame, and some simply staring at him in disbelief. The loud, powerful sound of the room felt unreal, almost distant, as if he were listening from underwater. All he could hear clearly was the beating of his own heart, still racing from the last notes he had played. He took a small breath, unsure what to do next. Should he bow? Should he step away? Should he simply stay seated until the applause quietened? He had never been in a moment like this before, not once in his entire life. Every time he imagined performing somewhere grand, he only pictured a modest clapping, maybe a few kind words. But this was something he didn't even dare to dream about. The crowd was acting as if they had just witnessed something unforgettable. He stood slowly and offered a small bow, which only made the cheers rise again. People pressed closer to the stage, trying to get a better look at him. A few even shouted words of praise, telling him how deeply the performance had touched them. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, he noticed the one man he expected to be silent, the Tycoon. The businessman who had mocked him earlier was no longer leaning back in confidence. He wasn't even sitting anymore. He had risen to his feet, but not with the pride he carried before. His face looked strangely soft, the hard lines around his eyes loosened, and his usual superior expression was gone. He wasn't clapping. He just stood there, looking at the young pianist as if someone had replaced reality with something he couldn't explain. When the applause finally started easing, people returned to their seats, though many kept watching him with admiration. The host of the event approached the stage with a stunned expression still on his face. He wasn't even trying to hide it. He just gave the pianist a gentle nod, almost like a parent trying not to show too much emotion. Before the host could speak into the microphone, the Tycoon suddenly stepped forward from the crowd. The room, which had been full of scattered murmurs and whispers, grew quiet again within seconds. Everyone knew what this man represented: money, power, influence, confidence, and reputation. People often adjusted their behavior around him, but tonight, he seemed like someone entirely different. He walked toward the stage, his footsteps slow, almost hesitant. The pianist felt his stomach tighten. He didn't know what the man planned to say. Was he going to criticize him again, claim he had been tricked, or make some sort of remark to save face? The silence was heavy, stretching thin like a fragile thread waiting to snap. But when the Tycoon reached the edge of the stage, he did something no one expected. He looked up at the young pianist, eyes steady, and he bowed his head. Not a small nod, a real bow, a gesture that carried weight, humility, and a message that didn't need explanation. Gasps filled the room for the second time that night. When he finally straightened, he asked for the microphone. His voice carried differently now, stripped of the arrogance it held earlier. "I owe this young man an apology," he said clearly, and the room shifted with surprise. "Tonight, I judged someone without knowing him. I made a harsh assumption, and I was wrong, very wrong." The pianist felt heat rising in his face. But this time it wasn't shame. He didn't know exactly what it was. Maybe disbelief, maybe gratitude, maybe something in between. The Tycoon continued. "What we just witnessed, it wasn't a performance. It was a gift, a reminder that talent can rise from anywhere, from anyone, regardless of background or status. I am humbled, and I say this openly, in front of everyone here." The murmurs grew louder as people exchanged astonished glances. It wasn't common to hear such words from someone like him. He turned toward the young pianist again. "Young man," he said, "your father would be proud. I don't even know your full story, but I felt it in every note you played. The emotion, the truth, the pain, the hope. You made everyone in this room feel something real." Hearing those words made the pianist's chest tighten. He didn't expect anyone to mention his father, let alone someone like the Tycoon. The man continued, "If you'll allow me, I would like to support your future, not as an attempt to fix my mistake, not as a business move, but because talent like yours deserves to grow." He paused, letting the words settle. "I would like to sponsor your training, your travels, your concerts, whatever you need. No conditions, no expectations, only support." The room erupted in soft sighs and whispers. It wasn't every day a powerful man admitted wrongdoing so openly, and it was even rarer to see such humility paired with generosity. The pianist didn't know what to say. His throat felt tight, as if emotion was pressing against it from inside. He looked around the room, at all the faces waiting for his response. Some encouraging, some emotional, some just stunned. He looked at the Tycoon, who stood there quietly, waiting, not pushing. Finally, he found his voice. "Thank you," he said softly, but the microphone carried the words clearly across the hall. "I didn't think anyone would ever offer something like that to me. I only came here hoping not to embarrass myself. I didn't expect anything more." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I accept, not because of the offer itself, but because you were willing to apologize. That means a lot." The Tycoon's shoulders softened, and he nodded slowly, grateful for the answer. The host stepped forward again, smiling warmly. "Well," he said, "I think we all witnessed something much bigger than music tonight." The audience laughed softly, a warm, gentle laughter that filled the room with ease. It wasn't the kind of laughter that made someone feel small. It was the kind that made everyone feel connected after the event ended. Many people approached the pianist to congratulate him. Some shared personal stories, some thanked him for the emotional journey, and some simply shook his hand with a smile. A few musicians who had years of experience came to tell him how rare it was to see someone play with such heart. Every moment felt overwhelming, yet beautiful in a quiet way, even after the crowd thinned out. A few people remained near the stage, still talking among themselves about how unbelievable the night had been. The pianist finally had a moment to sit down on the edge of the stage, letting his muscles relax. His hands were still slightly trembling from the intensity of the performance, and everything that followed. The host approached him and sat beside him. "You know," he said softly, "you changed something tonight. Not just in the music world, not just for the guests, but for that man too. He might not admit it fully, but you opened a door in him that had been closed for a long time." The pianist wasn't sure what to say. He just nodded quietly, thinking about all the moments that had led him hear his father's encouragement. The old keyboard, the long nights filled with practice, the doubts, the fear, the small victories. And now this night, he looked out at the hall, which was almost empty now. The lights were dimming, the staff were cleaning up, and the smell of evening perfume still lingered faintly in the air. Everything felt calm after the storm of emotions. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "You ready?" It was the Tycoon, standing a little distance away, not wanting to intrude. The pianist smiled. "Yes." The man stepped closer. "There's someone I'd like you to meet. A friend of mine runs a music academy. Not just any academy, one of the best. I think you should talk to him." The pianist nodded, feeling another wave of disbelief. "Thank you," he said again, even though it felt like the words weren't enough. "You don't owe me anything," the Tycoon replied gently. "Just keep playing like you did tonight. That's all." As they walked out of the hall, the cool night air greeted them. The sky was clear, with stars scattered across it like tiny sparks. The city lights glowed softly in the distance, and the sound of traffic hummed far away. The pianist took a deep breath, feeling the crisp air fill his lungs. It felt like a new beginning. A door he had never imagined had opened, not because he sought it, but because he stayed true to what he loved. The night had started with doubt, mockery, and pressure, but it ended with respect, opportunity, and a promise for a future brighter than he had ever dared to imagine. And as he walked forward, one quiet thought settled peacefully in his heart. Sometimes, all it takes is one moment of courage to change the path of an entire life.